Okay, I've taken my clock.
Welcome to Tony at 12. I'm Tony LeBlanc, and today I'm in conversation with James Lancaster, MD of Alderney Electricity. We're going to discuss the reasons behind the huge rise in the cost of energy and look at how it's likely to affect Alderney. James, good to see you as ever.
Good to see you, Tony. Hello. Here we are again. Here we are again.
It's been a little while, though, I have to say, but
yeah.
It's good to see you again. Let's start off with the international oil and gas prices. What caused it, in your view?
Well, it's obvious, isn't it? Really, oil and gas operating commodity markets. So, commodity markets, in order for prices to stay stable, the world needs to be a stable place.
Yeah.
And so when Mr. Putin decides it's a jolly fine idea to invade Ukraine, every system out there gets a thumping big shock, including all of the commodity markets, and the prices go haywire. Anticipating that there is likely to be a shortage of supply, because of course Russia is a huge producer of oil and gas for Europe, then the commodity markets respond accordingly and prices go through the roof.
Because it wasn't that long ago when they were giving away West Texas oil.
Well, yes, how times change.
Yeah,
I think this is what we see. We live in uncertain times, and what we are seeing is a real function of the volatility of the markets that actually affect our everyday lives. Most of the time we ignore them. Most of the time all these things happen in the background. But when something like this happens, it brings it right to the forefront of everybody's mind. And that's what we're seeing here. And I think it's, the thing to remember is that the markets, particularly the commodity markets, are agnostic about what's actually going on. They don't operate, they're not moral in that sense. They are there to make money for their principles, and therefore the markets, the traders within those markets, irrespective of how they may feel as individuals, will see this as an opportunity to make a lot of money, irrespective of the suffering that may be below the root cause of these price changes in the first place, or indeed the suffering which may come downstream as more and more people get pushed into fuel and energy poverty. These are the things that we have to live with, and these are the this is the volatility. The markets are betting against us in that sense.
Do you think, though, that possibly with COVID as well, production was cut because the demand wasn't there?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so you end up with a perfect storm, really. So all of these things come together, and it's the rogue wave, if you will.
Yeah.
So we're all bobbing along quite happily on this sea, and suddenly out of nowhere comes a rogue wave, and this is what hits us.
Yeah. And of course, looking at Germany, for example, they really put all of their eggs in one basket. What a mistake to cut their nuclear generation facility.
But case in point, isn't it? I mean, Angela Merkel's has been vilified over this, but at the time that the important decisions were being taken in Germany, which is a decade or so ago now, she was being feted as a visionary. Hindsight's a wonderful thing, isn't it? And I think the reality is that I don't think anybody either could or perhaps didn't want to envisage what someone with the power of Vladimir Putin could do if he was so minded. I think they were determined to believe that that actually no individual could operate at that level, and not be held to account over it.
But wouldn't you and I have taken note of Crimea in 2014 and said to ourselves, well, we've got to make sure something is, we've got some sort of a reserve policy here, just in case.
Well, I mean, would we? Like I said, Tony, hindsight is a marvelous thing, and we are all absolutely brilliant at knowing what the right thing to do is, armed with that 20/20 hindsight.
Yeah.
We are talking about some pretty clever people actually who were involved in taking these decisions at the time, and the focus around that time was, particularly for Germany, it was a drive towards renewables. Now, of course, actually they went absolutely gangbusters for renewables. And so actually almost destabilized their internal energy markets at the time, gave themselves a lot of trouble. But the problems that they caused themselves were solved by access to Russian oil and gas.
Yeah. And that's really where it all went wrong as far as they were concerned, wasn't it? Because I mean, the Russian the amount of oil and gas that Russia supplies Germany is incredibly large as a proportion of their total energy consumption, isn't it?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think the thing to do is you say, all right, okay, fine, we can take the example of somewhere like Germany, but it's been a real wake-up call for everybody. Because I don't remember all of commentators at the time all coming out in arms and saying Germany are mad to do this.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
I think most commentators in most of the European countries were looking at it and thinking, well, how can we achieve the same thing?
And of course, we now find ourselves in a position where energy prices are substantially high. Do you think they'll come down, James, or do you think they'll stay high as part of the cost of decarbonisation? Because that's not going to come for free.
It's absolutely not. I think the opinion is divided on the subject. If on one hand, if decarbonisation is forced by the reducing supply, naturally reducing supply of fossil fuels, oil and gas, then the price of those fuels is just going to keep rising because supply is always going to underperform demand.
Yeah.
The reality is as we move towards cleaner forms of energy, and bear in mind that nuclear is now reckoned as clean and low carbon. It has its issues, but it's not a high carbon energy source. Then the argument says, well, actually, if we move fast enough into renewables and nuclear, actually we may find ourselves in a situation where we've got an excess of fossil fuels.
Yeah.
So if anything, for a period of time, you might actually see fuel prices coming down. We have, I think, the price. I mean, what do we see when the invasion first happened? Within a couple of days, the price of crude oil rocketed. It got up to shade over $120 a barrel, something like that. And if you follow the price in the meantime, then it's almost like sort of an elastic system. So the price then started to fall back, and it fell below the natural price under the commodity market. Then it rose back up again, and it slowly cycled to the point where those perturbations got less and less. And it's now settled out to around about $105, $106 dollars a barrel. But we're still seeing some lag in the system. And so, there is perhaps even some estimation that even in the short term, in the the next 6 months or so, prices will start to fall back down again, particularly prices of the derivatives of crude oil, so the diesels and kerosenes, the things which we are so reliant upon on Alderney.
Yeah. Now, interestingly, in the Telegraph the other day, they did a business bit about a fund called Merchants Trust, and they're saying buy BP and Shell, and they're saying that because they think that in the case of both companies, they're sufficiently large to wean themselves off fossil fuel and make a genuine contribution towards renewables. Yeah,
I think that's the case, but I think there is also the other side of it is that you might look at that is rather than the success of or potential success of the Shells and BPs, let's look at the catastrophic failure of an energy company like Bulb. Lots of the these smaller emergent energy companies went to the wall with rising gas prices because they hadn't hedged, and yet they had promised their customers low prices, and so the gap dwindled to the point where they all went bust. Most of them just got mopped up by the other oil companies under the so-called supplier of last resort mechanism, but Bulb was too big. Bulb was, a couple £billion company, and so just could not simply be absorbed into one of the larger energy providers. What lessons came out of that? The lesson that really came out of that is that the underlying energy supply is, given the volatilities that we were talking about earlier on, is not really something for startup companies, high growth companies, because in order to manage that volatility, what you want is to push risk as low as possible. So you layer a high risk company on top of a high volatility market, and it's going to go wrong sooner or later. And I think that's the lesson that's come out of that. And so what people, I think, are sensibly saying is, look, we can't do anything without energy these days. Everything is absolutely critical. Everything that everybody does, whether as a corporate, as a company, or as an individual, relies upon access to energy, and we can't risk losing it.
No.
And so what we need to be reliant upon are companies which have a good approach to risk and are large enough to be able to weather these perturbations. And ultimately, that those are the companies which we hope are going to lead this revolution away from the high carbon fuels into this low carbon era that we need to get into. And so it's not surprising that when you start to think of it in those terms, you think, well, crikey, why aren't we all buying shares in Shell and BP? It's the obvious way to go, isn't it?
Yeah.
And that's all it's saying.
Yeah.
Have you bought any?
Yes.
Good man. Good man. There you are, everybody. You heard it here first. Tony's tip for the day.
Well, they've gone up, but you just accept the fact with these things they're possibly going to go down as well. So it's long term, but they pay good dividends.
Yeah, well, exactly so, because again, they're low risk companies, and therefore they can afford to have dividend policies. If you are at the point where actually, you're fortunate enough to have savings, it kind of makes sense to put some money into those low risk stocks, doesn't it?
Well, there we are.
You get much more than that out of your bank than you will out of your building society.
Well, that's right. That's right. Even with the risk.
Yeah.
What about UK onshore wind? This is a bit political, isn't it, in terms of not wanting to offend constituencies? But surely, it makes sense to have it onshore as well as offshore. Must be cheaper onshore.
Yes. It's a function of policy, isn't it? We keep talking about energy policy, don't we? Before the war in Ukraine, the UK only had 3 pillars of its energy policy. And those were decarbonisation, affordability, and security. Now, energy security in the sense of making sure it doesn't switch off.
Yeah.
Okay. So availability. Independence. So energy independence really wasn't part of UK policy. Hence, there was a lot of talk about interconnectors and all these other things, and getting power, all the excess power we needed from France and Iceland and Norway by, laying cables all over the place. Independence has come back onto the agenda with a bang. So, in the last 8 weeks, that's pretty much all anybody's been talking about from an energy point of view. And so, not surprisingly, if you say, okay, if we're going to talk about energy independence, what are we going to do? Right, well, first thing we're going to do is we're going to end the moratorium on onshore wind, because that's just obvious.
Yeah.
We're going to look to our mature technologies, which are solar and wind from a renewable point of view, and nuclear as a mature technology. And so we're going to advocate the building of vast offshore wind farms as well. We are going to reverse the trend because we recognize that actually nuclear is a damn fine way of balancing the books when independence is now much more important to us. And so we are going to get our nuclear program back on track and build another 10 nuclear power stations by 2050.
Yeah.
And in the meantime, we're going to open the valves on the gas pipelines. We're going to push to see if we can actually tap into more gas reserves in the North Sea. We're going to open up coal seams where we previously shut them, and we're going to start putting, coal into coal-fired power stations. These are all of the, these are all the words. These are all the sort of. This is the noise that we're hearing coming out of Westminster at the moment. And if you think about it, as soon as you put independence back on the not just back on the table, but actually push it right up the priority list, then these are the things that are going to happen. I don't know if you remember, but over the years that we've been having these conversations, I have referred to a little toy that the UK's Department of Energy and Climate Change came up with about a decade or so ago. And it was an online tool that they put up onto their website that allowed you to go and play and be in charge of the UK energy system.
Yeah.
And the premise was very, very simple. By with all of the growth projections out there, the challenge that you had in this game was to balance the UK's energy supply by 2050. And you could do whatever you want. You could build wind farms, they could onshore, offshore. You could put up big solar farms. You could turn half of Cornwall over to growing biomass crops, whatever you wanted to do. Sorry, Cornwall, I didn't know there's no particular slur on Cornwall there. Cornwall, we love you. Sorry,
other counties are available.
yes. First county that came to mind is love you so much, Cornwall. Yeah. And at the end, you played with this, and it was great fun, except you always got to a point in 2050 where there was always a shortfall. You couldn't produce enough power at all times of day, night, year to meet energy demand. And there was only one way that you could deal with that, and that was to build nuclear power stations.
Yeah. And that's accepted now, isn't it?
And that's kind of accepted. Yeah. But the thought was, up to that point, they said, well, actually, if France is building nuclear power stations, if Europe's got plenty of power, well, we don't need to build nuclear power stations. We'll just run cables and buy it from there. Now, all of a sudden, we're thinking, okay, that might not be quite so clever, might it? No, that's all we're seeing.
Yeah. The other thing is, of course, about the Cumbrian coal mine. I know it's a bit of an anathema to sort of say let's mine coal again, but it was for a specific purpose. As coking coal for the production of steel, and it's a lot cheaper to mine it in Cumbria probably than import it from Australia.
Yes, again, I think we are going to see a lot of work being done looking at the real price of underlying commodities, and as you say, it just doesn't make intuitive sense to believe that you can mine coal in Australia, stick it on a ship, ship it halfway around the world, and land it in wherever you're landing it in the UK for less money per ton than you can dig it up on your own doorstep.
Yeah.
So intuitively, it just doesn't feel right. It's the same thing. It doesn't. I can go into Co-op down the road and buy tomatoes from Chile.
Yeah.
It just doesn't feel right that I can get a tomato from Chile cheaper than I can get one from Guernsey. It just doesn't intuitively feel correct.
It's daft, isn't it? It really is.
It's just crazy. Yeah. And I think increasingly what we will see as we move into this, there's a thought experiment that I got involved with, which was being run by some guys from IBM. IBM employ people they call thought leaders. Once you reach a certain point and you've got your spurs in the IBM organization, they kind of cut you adrift a bit to just think about stuff.
Yeah.
It's quite a nice place to be in, actually.
So think tank.
Yeah, and one of the things that they were talking about, and this is a discussion again going back 10, 15 years or so, was actually what the currency of the future would be.
Yeah.
And going around and around the house and thinking about all the different things, about the only thing that everybody could come up with that would seem to make sense was energy. So you actually priced product on the energy content.
Yeah. And that's a good way of looking at it, surely, isn't it?
It's a good way of looking at it, because you say, okay, well, I've got a tomato here. And I put so much energy into growing that tomato. Now, if I've got to if I've got to heat a greenhouse, then obviously that's a lot more energy going into that tomato than I've got from just growing me tomato outside in the sunshine. But then I stick the tomato on a boat and I ship it across the Atlantic. Well, I stick it on a train and drive it across South America, then stick it on a boat and ship it across the Atlantic, or whatever I do. All of that has energy.
Yeah, it's correct. It's correct.
Yeah, and it just makes sense. It just seems intuitively sensible, doesn't it?
Now, tell me.
We talk about some fairly esoteric things, don't we?
We do indeed. We always have done. There's no doubt about that.
Sorry, everybody who's listening. We're off again.
Now, as a confused old codger, why have they decided to change energy ratings on appliances? Well, A with A 3 stars, was about the best you could get. Yeah. Now that's become B or C.
Yeah. It's grade inflation, isn't it?
But you educate a population to accept a certain way of discovering how much power appliances use, and then you change it. Do you know who's come up with this bright idea?
I don't actually. No, I don't.
No.
But it is just grade inflation. So you get to a point where what do you do when all your appliances are A plus 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 plus?
Put an extra plus in.
Well, yeah.
Okay.
There comes a point where we're just confused, and so you say, all right, look, fine. What we used to have A to E, but now they're all A of different pluses. So let's just start again, and we'll call them A to E again. And we'll just go around the cycle. That's what's happening.
I can see your logic, Mr. Lancaster, as ever. But there we are. Now,
it doesn't make any sense. Again, it would be much better to quantify it.
Yeah.
So when we were looking at it, the fact that a dishwasher is A++ and a fridge is A++ and a freezer is A++. Well, is that a basis of comparison between those different?
Well, not really. No, I mean you're not comparing a fridge against a washing machine, but if you looked at it quickly, you might. It's purely on power consumption, isn't it? Really,
well, exactly so, or the efficiency thereof.
Yeah.
But all of these, different appliances start from a different baseline.
Yeah.
And yet, where we need to go is to a much better understanding of what our total energy impact is.
Yeah.
And therefore we need bases of comparisons which allow us to compare apples with apples.
Let's get on to Alderney. Is it still cheaper to use oil to heat your hot water than an immersion heater?
Yes.
Yeah, so that still applies.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Okay.
And again, that's just a question of efficiency.
Yeah.
So you get 8 units of heat out for every unit of oil that you put in, whereas electricity you get 4 out.
Yeah. Okay, that's fine.
So now, that having been said, it comes back to efficiency. Heat pumps are now on the right side of the equation, I suggest.
Mm-hmm.
Because with a heat pump, you're getting 1 unit out for every 2 or 3 that you put in.
Yeah.
And so that brings the price of the cost back down to the same level as kerosene heating.
Yeah.
And I suggest with the energy price at the moment, it has probably now firmly tipped the balance in favour of heat pumps, albeit possibly only temporarily. But we're right; it's right on that limit. Of course, the issue you've got with the heat pumps and other new technology is the capital cost and of retrofitting them, because they don't work efficiently in all circumstances, and they're quite difficult to retrofit on old properties. But the point being here, and this is the point I want to make, is that as time moves on, so new technologies do come along, which change our perceptions there and challenge our ideals.
How are we doing actually on the price of oil? Because you base that on the price you have to pay as each shipment comes in.
Yep, still is. Yeah. So the underlying fact, the thing, where we talked about the volatility before, where we see the volatility is the actual price that we pay on the day that the fuel is loaded on the ship at the refinery. We are not in a position where we can hedge, simply because we just don't have enough fuels for us to be able to operate in the markets which really matter. So where we can, if we can take hedges, which we have done in recent years, it's really just a local deal with our fuel suppliers.
Yeah,
and largely based upon what their traders are prepared to give us in terms of price stability. But that's not, it's not. We're not trying to make money on it. In the way that we're working with it, a hedge is simply an insurance policy. Yeah. And it's an insurance policy that we take out for stable prices. I looked at it October last year, and actually in discussion with our fuel suppliers, decided it wasn't a good idea to hedge. But then, had I known then what I know now, I say that before everybody gets up in arms about it, the reality is the kind of hedges that we could have done would have had a force majeure contract in. So the kind of fuel prices that we'd seen would have blown that hedge out of the water.
Yeah.
So our deal would not have held.
So it just wouldn't have worked.
It's just too volatile, because the deals that we can do are valid as long as the price stays within a particular range. As soon as it goes outside of that range, the deal's off. So we wouldn't have got away with it anyway.
Obviously, a lot of people all over the UK and particularly probably in Alderney are feeling the pinch in terms of their ability. Can you offer any assistance in terms of people going through a bit of a hard time? Spread the payments perhaps, or something like that?
Yeah, and we always do.
Yeah.
Under also any circumstances, there will be times when individuals in the community, for whatever reason, are struggling at a particular time. And I think most people now know that if they pop into the office and have a chat with the very nice ladies in the office, as long as we know as long as we're talking about sort of genuine case,
sure,
then we will do what we can to actually help and spread payments or defer payments, or give people longer time, or put in payment plans that they can catch up.
There were some mutterings a few weeks ago that the states might be able to help in terms of a bit of a subsidy, but has that materialised or not?
It hasn't materialised. The decision we took at the time. So what's actually happened is that fuel prices have risen. So we had a shipment in February, and we had a shipment in April, and the price of fuel in the April shipment has now pushed us to the point where, all other things being equal, we would have gone to the States to ask for a rise in the electricity price cap.
Yeah.
Now, we haven't done that, because what we did was, when this all kicked off, I sat down with the States and we worked through the sort of numbers, and on the AEL side of things, we said, all right, look, we're lucky in the sense that of timing, that we're not going into the winter, we're coming out of the winter.
Yeah.
And so what we will do is we will not ask for a increase in the price cap until we have no choice in the matter. What we will do is we will just swallow any
just absorb it for a while.
Just absorb it. Absorb the additional cost for a while. Now, at the moment, we are absorbing about just below 4.5 pence per unit. So between now and the end of July, which is, we initially said, well, we'll do that for a first 3-month period and see what happens. On the pricing that we've actually now got on the fuel, we're looking at about, let's just say, 4.3 pence, something like that. Putting that into big numbers, that's going to cost the company 65 grand between now and the end of July.
Yeah.
So it makes a dent in the company's profits, but it doesn't force us into loss.
Right. Okay.
So for the moment, we are able to just absorb that. Obviously, there are discussions, because if it goes on and on and on and on and on, we can't sustain that indefinitely. But for the time being, certainly into the medium term, we will continue to absorb that. The decision that we took at the time was to say, look, actually, we won't come cap in hand to the states for this. What we will do is we will use the time this buys us to work, to allow, on one hand, to get a better understanding of what's actually likely to happen over the next 6 months, but then also to work with the states to think about what might happen when we reach October, November next year, when we start to go into the winter again.
Yeah.
And actually, that's when, if there is going to be a problem, that's where it's really going to hit. So the decision was to say to the states, look, leave your powder dry for the moment, because actually we may better that AEL just deals with this in the short term.
Yeah.
And we jointly think about how we might provide support to the community if the prices continue to rise and we are facing real difficulties going into the winter. Now, as it happens, I think there is, shorter setup. Who knows what's going to happen over the next 6 months? But if we have arrived at a new level of stability in the meantime, there is some hope that actually by August, by the time the next fuel shipments comes in, that prices actually might have gone backwards a bit, have gone down a bit.
Yeah.
So we're quite hopeful. I say that because there is a lag in the system, and the price that we had to pay in April was more than you would have expected just by comparing crude oil prices.
Yeah.
So I think what we did, what we've done is we caught February, we caught diesel on a rising price, diesel and kerosene on a rising price, and there is a little lag in the system. But where the price rose so high and started to fall back, what we've done in April is we've caught the diesel and kerosene prices on a falling price. Yeah. And so, if you like, we've managed to get the worst of both worlds.
Right.
And so the net result is that we have ended up paying more for those fuels than the steady state crude oil price would suggest we should.
Yeah.
So as long as the crude oil price stays the same, those prices should fall back by the middle of the year. In which case, the sort of numbers that we are talking about in terms of support to the community, and I'm sticking my neck out here, but I am touching all the wood that I can touch. Those numbers should be within the realms of manageability.
Okay. Now, when we last spoke, we were talking about tariff reform. Is that still on the table?
Yes, it's been tied up with the work with the state's energy policy.
Yeah.
So tariff reform is very much on the table. I think I can say, I think, without giving away the punchline, I can definitely say without giving away the punchline, the state's energy policy have done a really good job. They've been working actually very hard behind the scenes, and they've got a very, very good understanding now, I think, of the realities that we face. So that's in terms of both opportunities and the constraints. And I am expecting an early statement of what is effectively the island's energy policy to be made in the next month or so.
Good.
We had something from, obviously, the island plan in terms of the sort of targets which are set there for energy. It said, well, the good people of Alderney said we want cheaper electricity with cheaper energy and we want more renewables. Well, yeah, okay, that's fine. But the state's policy workers had to go into much more detail than that to look at what the constraints are and actually, therefore, what the journey looks like. And they've done a fantastic job. And so I think, we're going to start to see some headlines coming out and a really useful debate. And as part of that debate, we will then be looking properly at tariff reform. Tariff reform is tied up with the concession law.
Yeah.
And therefore, to go as far as we might will require, I think, a change in the legislative base. So it's not going to happen overnight. But what I think we can do is reach a point where we know what we want to do, and that can be publicised. And once everybody knows the direction of travel, they can then start to properly assess their individual circumstances in the context of that direction, and start to take some sensible decisions.
So in basic terms, possibly a higher standing charge and a lower unit price, so that anyone that's permanently resident here wouldn't see much difference.
On average, anybody permanently resident here would see a slightly lower price of
but
electricity. But we do remember electricity is only part of the equation.
Yeah, quite absolutely. Okay.
And when we talk about tariffs, we are talking about electricity only.
Yes.
Yes.
Looking at the way in which the price has gone up, how does that affect the Simec Atlantis deal in terms of strike price?
I haven't had. I haven't seen anything, and I haven't actually approached Cymex to find out where they are. There's lots been going on, so we haven't do it. So I certainly haven't seen anything come out of Cymex Atlantis in terms of the Normandy array, the Capital Hague array. So I don't think there's been any further work on that, though. This call is a sort of timely reminder for me to actually just have a quick dig around and see if anything is actually moving on that front. It was all held up pending a decision from the French government about what their regime for the support of renewable energy might be going forward. Of course, that's now all been thrown into disarray again by recent world events, and so I think we are still waiting to see what the outcome of that is going to be. The whole point being that once Simec Atlantis know what the funding regime for renewable energy, support of renewable energy is going to be, they can then revisit the economics of the trial array of Capital Hague, and at which point we should at least know whether or not that project stands a chance of going ahead or not.
But you're nearer the strike price now than you were a year or so ago.
Yeah, absolutely. So the strike, if we were to go on the basis of what we are looking at today, the strike price looks actually quite favourable. So that's fine. But then I think £96 a megawatt hour for nuclear looked quite favourable when they first announced that about 15 years ago in the UK, and now everybody thinks it's crazy. So I don't think it is sensible for us to take decisions on the back of these global, of the kind of global events which we are seeing, the unprecedented global events that we are seeing at the moment. So but bear in mind, and I think the lesson that we all need to take from this is it comes back to this word volatility. It doesn't actually take very much to push things to the point where schemes which previously looked economically unviable actually start to look very attractive.
Have you heard anything more about Fab? That seems to be, as an interconnector, that seems to have no.
It's a bit. I mean, I haven't. Has there been much talk on Ireland that you've picked up about Fab recently, or has it all been quiet?
Well, no, there's a bit in either the press or the journal, and they were talking about a couple of converter stations. But I don't see why you'd need a converter station if you weren't actually generating on Alderney via the tidal arrangement.
No. I haven't seen it.
But from an engineering point of view,
previously, from an engineering point of view, you need a converter station at each end of the cable.
Yes, but not an intermediate one.
You don't need anything in the middle unless you're going to do something in the middle.
Yeah, so I mean, I think possibly the people that wrote the article got it slightly wrong. Finally, goods and services tax.
Oh, yeah.
Which, is the equivalent of your VAT.
Yes.
Have you got any idea at the moment whether or not they would grant a bit of a concession on energy? I mean, it's 5%. 5% in the UK, isn't it?
Yeah, at the moment, VAT in the UK on energy is 5%.
Yeah.
So, there are plenty of precedents that say if you're going to have goods and sales tax, then energy is a fair target. The question simply becomes at what rate. So, but I can honestly say I am not aware. Nobody has come to me and said, we've got proposals to put X% GST on top of electricity. So at this moment in time, I don't think the dialogue has quite reached that level of detail.
No. Okay. Right. Well, that's it.
But I'm sure you will be the first to hear about it, Tony. Should that be...
I shall be on the phone to you as soon as I hear anything. But it's obviously the point at this point. The politicians are trying to plug the fact that they've got an 80 million a year hole, a deficit, and they need to fill it somehow.
I think reality does need to sort of kick in at some point. It is, the cost of delivering services, even in small economies like Alderney, is high.
Yeah.
Globally, the average cost of just existing is about 45% of GDP. So government governance and all the services that go with that typically cost 45% of GDP. Which what does that mean in Alderney terms? We'd be spending 25 million a year, something like that, and don't even get close to that. So the question arises that says, well, if you kind of want the standard of living in all of these services and otherwise, well, actually, you've got to pay for it somehow. I buy that, and the question arises, well, what's the best way of doing that, and what's the equitable way of doing that?
And talking about the equitable way, obviously GST hits everybody, whether you're wealthy or you're not so wealthy. But, personally, I'd like to see them put on this health surcharge of 3%, so that people on lower incomes probably wouldn't get caught at all because it would be linked to the income tax allowance, and people on higher incomes will just pay a bit more.
Yeah, I think the advantage that we do have in smaller communities is that the granularity of the economy is actually much more visible, and so you are in a position where you can start to make sort of kinds of sensible economic interventions at a taxation level, which really much more closely reflect the reality of the economy and the needs of the community. Whereas in larger economies, the cost burden of administering such a system itself would be prohibitive. Because you can't see it; it's just not visible. Whereas I think in a smaller community like Alderney, I think there are things where you can potentially take a rather more managed approach than simply applying a blanket tax at a particular rate.
Right, when are you going to stand for the States then?
Okay.
No comment. James, it's been an absolute pleasure, as always. Thank you so much for sparing us some time. And I've really enjoyed this chat.
Brilliant. Thanks ever so much, Tony.
And
see you next time.
See you next time. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.